Welcome to everybody. A few things to say at the start. First of all, to a certain degree, what I'm going to be talking about is massively oversimplified to the point of perhaps not even being entirely true. Um, the Roman army, like any institution, evolves over time and is in a constant state of flux. So the Roman army at the beginning of the first century CE is a different beast from the Roman army at the end of the second century CE. But I'm going to sort of give you a bit of a snapshot of the early imperial army from, say, about 30 BCE, when Octavian finally defeats Antony and Cleopatra and becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, through till the end of the second century, about 250 years later, at which point things start to change quite significantly. And we'll talk a little bit right at the end about some of the changes. Um, a lot of what we have, well, a lot of the early imperial army is in many ways the creation of this man. This is Augustus. This is a bust of him that was in Egypt somewhere, and then raiding people from south of Egypt came in and hacked it off and buried it in under the ground in one of their temples, where it was dug up by a British Museum exhibition a lot later. Um, the army is extremely important for the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire is, to all intents and purposes, a military dictatorship. Um, People sometimes talk about it as if it's some form of constitutional monarchy. It's not. Um, it's dressed up in the forms of constitutional monarchy. When a new emperor begins, laws are passed to give him the powers by which he rules. But he's got to that job because the army backs him, and because he's got the loyalty of the army, and nobody else matters, frankly. Um, the other thing I should say is there's an awful lot we don't know about the Roman army, and there's quite a lot that's actually open to debate. I'm going to try, hopefully, to indicate when I'm saying something that I think is my opinion, is not necessarily everybody's opinion. But bear in mind that there is an awful lot we don't know. So here is the distribution of the legions over the provinces. This is about the time, I think this is representing around about the time of the Emperor Hadrian, the distribution there. There's generally about 28 to 30 legions in operations at any one time. And there's also auxiliary units in the provinces. Of about the same number of men as are in the individual are in the legions in that provinces. So Britain's got 3 legions. It's got about the equivalent of 3 legions worth of additional auxiliary troops. I'll talk about auxiliary troops later. The legions are numbered but not consistently. So there are, I think there's about 5 first legions, at least 2 second legions, both of which served in Britain at various. At one point, there were 2 second legions serving in the province of Britain, which can get a bit confusing. The legions have acquired also names and titles to go with it, which allows them to allows us to sort of distinguish them. You'll note that the legions are in mostly on the frontiers. There's quite a lot of provinces that don't have any legions. In general, the arrangement of provincial government within the Roman Empire is that the provinces that have the military in them are governed on, in theory, on the Senate's behalf um, by the emperor, and the emperor appoints the governors for that. The provinces that don't have any legions have their governors appointed by the Senate. And in theory, that should stop people who don't want to get control of the armies getting control of the armies. Altogether, there's about 300,000 men, something 250 to 300,000 men under arms in the Roman Empire in, say, the 2nd century. That's out of a total population that's probably somewhere between 60 and 75 million people. That's not a lot of soldiers under arms. For a comparison, that's not very much more than all the armies that were involved in the Battle of Waterloo and the campaigns leading up to the Battle of Waterloo. There's about 250,000 men in the British Army and the Prussian Army and the French Army involved in the Battle of Waterloo. So there's a certain degree of bluff about the Roman army, that the Roman army protects the empire by, whenever anybody tries to cross over into the borders, the Roman army beats them very, very thoroughly. But the Roman army is more or less only really able to deal with one problem at a time. And there's a great, should people attack from more than what the Roman Empire from more than one direction, that's going to be a problem. And that's one of the things that does very much turn into a problem later on in the later history of the empire. Also, I want to draw attention to the number of legions and where they are, in particular with relation to the numbers of legions in Britain. Britain has 3 legions, which is quite a lot for a single province. You'll notice that there are Pannonia's got 4, but a lot of the provinces have only got 1 or 2 legions. And people sometimes say that shows how difficult it was to control Britain, because the British people were resisting the Romans, and therefore it needed a greater garrison to suppress them than was needed in anywhere else. I tend to think actually the issue here is logistics. If you are the governor in Upper Germany and something goes wrong, you send a messenger to the governor of Lower Germany and say, lend us a legion, could you? And the legion in Lower Germany can just sort of packs up their kit, and they're on the march almost immediately. If you're the governor of Britain and something goes wrong, then it gets a bit more difficult, because you can ask for reinforcements from Lower Germany, and they can pack their kit up and head off, but they're not going to get to you simply by marching. They are going to hit the English Channel. and they're going to need boats, and that requires more organisation. So I tend to think that the reason that Britain has so many legions is because it takes longer to send any reinforcements to Britain than it does to other parts of the empire. Anyway, let's talk about some of the actual bits and bobs. Here's some of the basic terms, the basic units um, of a legion. The smallest tactical unit is the contubernium, the so-called tent, which is of 8 men. A century is made up of 10 contubernium under the command of a centurion. A cohort is 6 centuries. Um, the previous tactical unit had been the maniple, which was 2 centuries working together. A cohort is essentially 3 maniples brought together. A legion, at least in the early imperial period, has 10 cohorts, of which 1 is double strength. And it also has headquarters troops, headquarters officers. It also has 120 horsemen. I'm carefully saying horsemen rather than cavalry there, because the legionary horsemen tended to do non-combat jobs that you required horses for. So they'll provide an escort for the commander. They'll provide, they'll perhaps do a little bit of scouting, or they'll convey messages that need conveying. The actual cavalry jobs for the Roman army mostly drawn from the auxiliary units that we'll talk about later. And there's also another term that you may see from time to time, which is a vexillation. This is, in the early imperial period, basically an ad hoc division that's been put together by pulling a few centuries from different cohorts, sticking them all together and saying, right, off you go. They'll be given a flag to identify, a vexillum, to identify them. But it's very much a temporary unit. Vexillations later become much more permanent units, but that again is for the late empire. So your contubernium, I think the name century implies that originally there were 100 men in this unit. Not everybody agrees with that, but that's what I think. So I think there must have been originally 100 men in the unit, which means probably there was originally 10 men to a contubernium, to a tent. This clearly at some point gets reduced to only 80. But this happens long before the imperial period. And when exactly this happened is just lost in the mist of time, and we can't really trace it properly. As has been suggested, so that some people thought that contubernium was in fact 8 men plus a couple of slaves, and you made the other century that way. Anyway, for the early imperial period, you've got 10 of these contubernia, 10 of these tent units to a century. If you look at barrack blocks from later in the empire, that clearly goes down. If you look at Vindolanda and look at the 3rd century barrack blocks in Vindolanda, there are only 8 contubernia there. Only eight rooms in the barrack blocks, so that suggests that the century has reduced to 8 contubernia, so it's now down to only 56 men. If you then go to the even later barrack blocks at Housesteads Fort on Hadrian's Wall, there's only actual 5 rooms of barrack blocks, 5 rooms of accommodation in those barrack blocks. The rest is workshops and other stuff. And that suggests that you're then dealing with a century of only about 40 men. Another thing is on campaign, each contubernium has got a mule for transport. And whether that's around when they're actually in base, in their bases, it's difficult to say. But certainly on campaign, each contubernium has a mule. Go up to the century. A century had it in command is in the command of a centurion. The centurion gives his name to a century. So a century, if somebody coming from a particular century who will say, I am from the century of Julius Vitalis. The promotion route within the centuries is for centurion is basically you're promoted. You start at the lowest rung, at the sort of bottom of the 6th century in a cohort. And then you work your way up until you're in command of the 1st century in a cohort. And then from there, you are then move on to the next cohort in your legion and work your way up until eventually you are the first centurion of the first cohort, century in the first cohort of the legion. In practice, I think it gets a lot more complicated. We know of one person who keeps transferring from legion to legion. So legion to legion transfers certainly happen, and there's one person who's sort of just kept going from legion to legion to legion, and it's not clear to me whether this was because he was really good and therefore got into new promotion opportunities whenever they came up, or whether every legion that got him was so determined, they thought he was so rubbish that they tried to get rid of him as soon as possible. There are a series of officers within the legion, the principales. He has an optio, a second in command, who he has chosen personally. There's a standard bearer who also deals with the money. There's a tesseraris, a 4th in command. He's got responsibility for the watchword and for keeping track of the movements. There's a custos armorum who is responsible for taking care of the equipment of the century. There would certainly be slaves around. The centurion certainly would have at least 1 or 2 slaves. Whether there were other slaves about, it seems to me not unlikely that there were, but we don't know. Each century has got a little bit of artillery. It's got a small ballista, which is a cross, basically a crossbow that fires bolts. It's also not clear whether how many of these officers are incorporated into the overall number of the century, and how many of them are separate from the actual number of 80 troops. I would say that since centurions all seem to have separate quarters in barrack blocks, they're probably not included in the 80 troops, but everybody else probably is. Although I know Guy de Lebediere in Gladius seems to think that the optios are not included in the overall paper strength of 80 of the century. I should say that all the figures that we give you here, these are paper strengths. These are ideally what should be in the unit. In practice, no unit is ever at its full strength. There's always people ill, or they've lost people. They need to make the numbers up somehow. So I'm very much talking about paper strengths when I do this. And I'm taking quite a long time to do this. I must speed up a bit. So the legionary soldiers are recruited from the Roman citizen population. In general, they're all volunteers. And you actually needed a couple of letters of recommendation to get into the legions. Only in emergencies are people enlisted into the legions who haven't really volunteered for it. Very few legionary after the end of the first century CE. Very few legionaries come from Italy. Evidently, the military career is not that attractive, and similarly, Greece doesn't supply a lot of people who find the military career attractive. They're mostly from places like Gaul and Germany and Spain, etc. Now, they are the elite infantry of the Roman army, but they're also the construction engineers of the Roman army. Modern armies separate these functions out. Roman army doesn't. You are both, as a legionary, you are both a royal engineer and a parachute regiment officer, a parachute regiment soldier. You do both. Some people involved in the engineering tasks and also various other jobs are immunes. They don't have to do the manual labor, so they don't have to do all the sort of horrible jobs that, like, sort of doing the watch or cleaning out the latrines. They don't have to do the manual labor that is involved in the construction of buildings. They don't have to do any of that stuff, but they do still have to drill and train. And if it comes to a fight, they will still have to fight. Worth saying also, when the legions produce these construction projects, these construction projects are a lot cheaper than you think they are. Because you might look at something like Hadrian's Wall and think that's a very expensive thing to build. It's a big construction. It costs almost nothing, because the main sources of your costs are labor and materials. And the Roman army, the labor is already there. It's already been paid for. It doesn't need to be paid for again. And the materials, they just don't go and take it. They just go and dig it out of the ground. If it's stone, if it's wood, they chop a few trees down. And similarly with the roads will cost almost nothing to build, because most of the material you just pick up, most of the labor you don't need to pay for it. A legionary will generally serve for about 25 years. Originally, Augustus set that as 16, but he progressively increased it. At the end of their service, originally they were granted a land settlement, somewhere to settle. Progressively, that is translated into cash, and a legionary at the end is given something like 120 gold pieces, which is it's a lot of money. It's about a decade's worth of money, a decade's worth of pay for a legionary. They are given as their final settlement. About half the legionaries probably don't make it. Probably about half of the army don't make it to retirement. You could join at any point from about, people could join from as young as sort of 13, 14 if they were tall enough. There's a height restriction. Most people joined about sort of 18 to 20. And served through until their mid-40s. You could join up to about 35 was the maximum age for joining the legions. Cohort does not have a separate commander. The cohort is commanded by the senior centurion of the senior century within that cohort. There are people who are the cohort's tesseraris, who acts as a clerk and deals with the unit's pay. There's a standard bearer. There's a trumpeter. Again, these are almost certainly within the overall numbers. There's no separate headquarters staff for a cohort. Cohorts are numbered within a legion. There is a sort of separate headquarters staff for the legion itself. There is the legatus legionis, the overall commander. Now, he is a senior member of the senatorial class. He has done some time in military service. He's probably done some political jobs. He's probably perhaps even governed a small senatorial province before he's appointed as commander of a legion. His second in command is the Tribunus Laticlavius. This is the opposite end of the senatorial order. This is somebody who is just starting out on their senatorial career, so probably somebody in their, at the most early 20s, maybe sort of late teens, really wet behind the ears. But because he's got senatorial status and nobody else in the Legion has, apart from the legate, he is normally second in command. In practice, it looks like the legatus, the legate, never let the tribune Laticlavius actually out of his sight, and wherever the legate goes, the tribune goes with him, and so much of the actual running of the legion then falls upon the praefectus castrorum, the third in command, the prefect of the camp, and he's an extremely experienced soldier. He's somebody who's been a primus pilus centurion, so he's got decades of service behind him, and his job presumably is to tell the tribune, do you think that's wise, sir? Then there are 5 equestrian tribunes, the Tribuni Angusti Clavi. They are all people who will have commanded an auxiliary cohort before taking this job, so they're experienced. The senior centurion of your legion is the primus pilus. He is commands the first century, the first cohort. There's somebody who is the legion's eagle standard bearer Aquilifer, and then there is the tabularium legionis, the administrative staff. But again, I suspect they are not actually separate from the rank and file of the legion. They are all people within the rank and file of the legion who have certain special jobs. They are the people who are immunes. Legion will be based in a big legionary fortress. This is the one at Chester. Big legionary fortress will have all sorts of things within it. There are barracks. There are special houses for the commanding officers. There's a headquarters building. In many ways, it's a miniature town. The headquarters building imitates the forum and basilica that you'd find at the middle of a Roman town. The praetorium, the commander's residence, looks very much like the sort of houses that you find in a Roman town. And there's also granaries, there are baths, there are hospitals, there are all sorts of things. Here is a typical legionary centurion. This is Marcus Favonius Facilis. You can see his gravestone in the British Museum's exhibition. Interesting things from here. He's carrying the vine stick of the legion of the centurion, which was a symbol of his office and also a practical tool with which he could beat recalcitrant soldiers. And also, Facilis, his burial has been paid for by his two freedmen, his two freed slaves, Verecundus and Novicius, which tells us that centurions had slaves. There are also elite units at Rome, which I'm not going to, for the matter of time, I'm not going to go into too much. The Praetorian Guard, the urban cohorts, and the vigiles, who are the sort of watchmen who have particular responsibility for watching out for fires and stuff like that. Police functions in the Roman state, the sort of functions that modern police carry out. Some of them just don't get done. Some of them are done by private individuals. Some of it is done by the army. And in Italy itself, it'll be done by the urban cohorts and the vigiles. And then there is the auxiliary. In the period of the Roman Republic, Rome would make alliances with neighboring states. And as part of those alliances, there would be an obligation on the neighboring state to produce some troops when Rome asked for them. And the auxiliary really sort of draws from that. Rome doesn't have the same sort of allies anymore by the empire, but the auxiliary trace their roots back to that. They are generally recruited from non-citizens, although if you could join the auxiliary as a citizen if you couldn't get into one of the legions, and we know that people did. A lot of the members of the auxiliary will be volunteers, but some of them are conscripts. The conscription is not always necessary in order to keep the numbers up, but it's very often done in order to take young men away from their homes and send them to the other side of the empire, where they won't have any particular loyalty to the locals and therefore they can't cause trouble. This is a thing that actually many people resented the dialectus very much. There's an idea, a bit of a myth, that the legions give you heavy infantry and the auxiliaries give you everything else. That's not true. The auxiliaries, at least 2/3 of the auxiliaries, are also heavy infantry. And there are battles like the Battle of Mons Graupius, where the commander Agricola sends in the auxiliary units first, holding the legions in reserve, and the auxiliaries win the battle for him. They did provide light armed infantry. They provided a lot of other specialist troops, but 2/3 of it is heavy infantry. Apart from that, you've got the mixed cavalry infantry unit, the cohors equitata, which is sometimes called a mounted infantry unit, but it's not mounted infantry in the way that we think of it. It's not infantry who use horses to go to the battlefield and then dismount to fight. A cohors equitata is a unit that has got a number of infantry centuries, but it's also got some cavalry troops in it. They certainly provide the cavalry. The nearest Rome has to the sort of mounted infantry combat is that the cavalry units did sometimes fight on foot. Also archers, mounted archers, boatmen, slingers, all sorts of stuff. The auxiliaries didn't generally build the infrastructure in the way that the legions did, but they could repair the infrastructure, and progressively they do more and more of building the infrastructure as well. They're generally formed into cohorts of about 500 men or about 1,000 men. The cavalry are found into wings of 500 men or occasionally 1,000 men. Each province has got 1,000 strong cavalry unit, which is the most prestigious cavalry unit in the province. The internal structure of a cohort is very similar to a legions, but they have different equipment from the legions. Members of the auxiliaries are not Roman citizens, but their commanding officers always are. It's probably about 40,000 of them in Britain. They served for 25 years. They gained citizenship on their discharge. They probably don't have a cash settlement. And the other thing that people sometimes get wrong about the auxiliaries, imagining that they're part of the structure of the legion. So Rosemary Sutcliffe in The Eagle of the Ninth has Aquila describing himself as in command of the fourth cohort of Gauls of the Second Legion. We don't have any unit that's described like that. Yes, the auxiliaries fight alongside the legions, and if the senior commander about is the commander of the legion, they will take orders from the commander of the legion on campaign. But when they're in their bases, they seem to report directly to the governor. They don't report to the latest big legion, to the closest legionary base. Most auxiliary officers, if they're 1,000 strong, well, if they're mostly prefects, but they can be tribunes if the unit is 1,000 strong, or if it's of Roman citizens, which means that the unit has been given Roman citizenship en masse at some point as a reward. It does not then mean that anybody who joins the unit after that point will be a Roman citizen. After that, it goes back to the standard non-citizens joining the unit, but they can keep that of Roman citizens' name. But again, things sometimes have to be mucked around with. We've got we know of 1,000-strong units commanded by prefects when they should be commanded by tribunes. Sometimes a centurion from a legion will be put in charge of an auxiliary cohort because they can't find anybody else. Below that, below the command, the infantry repeat the ranks of the legions. Cavalry units are called wings and broken up into troops. They're commanded by a decurion, with a second in command will be a duplicarius, who's a soldier on double pay. The fleet units are part of the auxiliaries. They're the most socially looked down on part of the auxiliaries, but they are not. There isn't a separate fleet. There isn't a separate navy in the Roman military. It's the navy is a particular type of auxiliary, and they're also the numeri and the cunae. These are infantry and cavalry units that have just been recruited short term. They're not within the formal boundaries of the auxiliary. They don't get the rewards of the auxiliaries after 25 years service. They probably won't serve for 25 years. They eventually become a bit more fixed again. Here's a typical auxiliary, which is Longinus, called Longinus Stapedematicus. This tells you something about the way in which the auxiliaries work, that they recruit from the borders, and they recruit people, in this case from Thrace, who have very strange, outlandish names. So they give them all Latin names when they join, and they become known by their Latin names rather than their what are perceived as their outlandish foreign names. An auxiliary fort pan looks like a shortened, small version of a legionary fortress, with the headquarters building in the centre, commanding officers building off to one side. They have granaries. A granary seems to be able to support about a year's worth of food for 500 men. So there's enough food to keep the unit going for quite a long time. Cavalry forts, this is based on Benwell as it was imagined in the 19th century, but recent work at not actually at Chester's, but at Segedunum at Wallsend has shown that actually the cavalry did not stable their horses separately. Cavalry barracks had back rooms and front rooms, and in the back room um, you had three troopers, and in the front room you had their three horses, and quite possibly slaves as well to groom their horses. And that fosters a very close relationship between the troopers and the horse. Um, Outside every fortress or fort, you get an extramural settlement, the so-called vicus. This is providing everything that the army can't provide to the soldiers. So there's gambling dens, there's prostitutes, there's places for your common law to set up with your common law wives. As soldiers below the rank of centurion are not supposed to marry, but many of them set up relationships as well. Anyway, and your centurions are allowed to marry, so they may well have wives that they don't necessarily want to have living within the fort. It used to be thought there was quite a strong line between the vicus and the fort, that the civilians lived in the vicus and all the soldiers lived in the fort. We now know from work at Vindolanda, that's a much more permeable line. There's civilians living in the fort, there's soldiers living out in the vicus. Smaller things, we have what are called mile castles on Hadrian's Wall, otherwise known as fortlets. These are small places where maybe a contubernum, a tent, can set itself up. There are towers, signal towers, watch towers. This is one up at the top right. You've got one from Trajan's Column, and there's a couple of reconstructions. That's the one on Vindolanda on the left, and in the middle, a digital reconstruction of a Hadrian's Wall turret. This just is a nice chart that's actually in the Legion exhibition, which tells you roughly how much people were paid. So your basic legionary soldier makes 300 denarii a year. A reasonably skilled workman can expect to make about a denarius a day. So, in strictly speaking, the legionary is paid less than that. But the legionary has a steady yearly annual income, whereas a worker is going to be very much dependent on whether the work's there for them. Auxiliary soldiers are probably paid a bit less than that, 250. An auxiliary is probably paid twice as much. Cavalry have additional allowances for paying for the horse. A centurion can make about 15 times basic pay at the lowest level of centurion, which goes up to 60 by the time he's a primus pilus. Out of that, they do have to buy all their equipment. So they don't get provided equipment by the unit. They have to pay for that. But nonetheless, it's quite a nice, you get steady income, and you get decent place to stay, which you have to put some money towards, but it's better than a lot of the living conditions that a lot of other people are living in. I'm just going to round off now with what happens at the end of this period that we're talking about. In the 2nd century, several things happen. First of all, there's a plague in the middle of the 2nd century, which seems to come from China and probably comes along the Silk Road and is then brought from the east of the empire into the center of the empire by soldiers coming back from the campaign in the east. That's devastating. It kills a lot of people. the army has to recruit a lot of people to replace everybody who's died. And that means that there's going to be a lot of people leaving the army at the same time who are going to need paying for. The Emperor Septimius Severus, who we see on the left here, has to deal with that. And also, he very much wants to keep the army on his side. So he increases their pay, which has not gone up for a very long time, but he more or less doubles it, which has to then be paid for. And then his son Caracalla makes a declaration that all adult males within the empire will become Roman citizens, which is probably a tax-raising move. But it eliminates the distinction between the legionaries and the auxiliaries. And so in the 3rd century, the army changes a lot. Also, you have a period of about 50 years in which there's a whole series of civil wars and civil strife that involves the army. So the late Roman army looks very different. These are late Roman soldiers. They don't look like what you think Roman soldiers look like. And although many of the units of the old Roman army still survive, they've been turned into what are called legionary permanent station units, permanently stationed on the borders. And in very many cases, they're much smaller than they were. So the army is divided into the legionary, the comitatenses, which is a mobile field army, and also the palatini, which are troops under the emperor's own personal command. But I'm by no means an expert on the late Roman army, so we will leave that, and I will just finish by sticking in an unillustrated plug for 2 walks I've got coming up. A mythological walk through Pall Mall, looking at figures from Greek and Roman mythology that are used on the in the public architecture and in the architectural landscape of London. And then on the 2nd of March, I'm doing a walk through Roman Colchester. So that is the end. I will stop sharing.
So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? You will need to unmute yourselves. I've got 4 questions. So whether I'll ask one to give everybody a chance. So was there a reason why there are only auxiliaries in Britain? Or was that...
No, there are auxiliaries and legions. Sorry, I hope I didn't get the impression that there are only auxiliaries in Britain. Everywhere there are legions, there are auxiliaries. Everywhere there are auxiliaries, there are legions.
Oh, okay. And the slaves?
Yes.
Did they go out to war, or did they stay behind and look after the camp?
That probably depends. I think it depends on the length of the campaign. If you're just sending a small bunch of troops out of a permanent fort, then probably the slaves are going to stay back. If it's a major campaign, such as Septimius Severus's campaign into Scotland, then there will be a massive camp followers. So there will be slaves, there will be women. Everybody will uproot and head on. We know there's a very famous disaster, the Varian disaster in AD 9, in which 3 legions get wiped out in Germany. And we know that it's not just wiping out the legions, and it's not just wiping out the auxiliary troops that are accompanying those 3 legions. It's also wiping out all the camp followers and all the slaves that were
Right.
accompanying them. Just the movement of a single legion, which looks like is 5 or 6 thousand men. It's actually much more than that, because it'll be 5 and 6 thousand men, and if it's actually on an active campaign, it'll be 5 or 6 thousand men plus 5 or 6 thousand auxiliaries plus however many thousands of wives and children and dependents and the like.
Gosh, that's a lot. Okay. So I can't pronounce it, when you were listing all of the different first of command, second in command, when
Yeah.
Augustus was in the army, would he have been classed as a second in command?
When Augustus was in the army,
Well, he went to a battle, didn't he? But then he was ill and didn't take part. So
yeah, no,
was
yeah,
there
he
unofficially?
spends that. Well, I mean, he all the battles that Augustus is at, Philippi and Actium. He's in charge.
Oh, okay.
I mean, Philippi, he's in joint command with Mark Antony, and he's got one side of it, and Mark Antony's got the other side of it. But he is the commanding general
Gosh.
at the Battle of Actium, which he does spend the entirety of it chucking up into a bucket. But he is nominally the commanding general.
Oh, okay. Gosh, he was very young.
Yeah, well, yeah, he's extremely, extremely young, but this is why everybody underestimated him, because they thought he was just a kid.
Mm, okay. I've still got questions. I'm sorry about this. So, for the auxiliaries, did these people in Gaul or wherever, did they consider the Roman army as a career path? Would it
Yeah,
have been, yeah, whereas the Romans by that time didn't?
well, it depends how you want to define Roman.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
I mean, Roman citizens certainly consider the legions a career path.
Oh, okay.
Um, not very many of them, not very many people who actually lived in Italy itself, or people who lived in Greece, saw it as a career path. They saw that there were what they thought were better career paths.
Mm,
But Roman citizens living in places like Egypt, or living in Gaul, or living in Spain, absolutely saw the legions as a career path, and they would join up, and hopefully, if they were lucky, they would live through the next 25 years and come out with a nice tidy little nest egg. And the auxiliaries, again, the non-citizens within the army, within the empire, they very much, again, saw the army as a career path, because they joined up with the army, they spent 25 years with it, and at the end of it, they become Roman citizens.
yeah. It's a long time though, isn't it?
It
There's
is
a lot of battles potentially.
it is long. I mean, it's carefully judged, I think. I mean, I don't think that they had the the stats to back it up, but I think they Augustus places eventually the amount of service at 25 years, because he thinks that's a point at which it's affordable.
Right.
That
Okay. You need
uh,
some to die.
half, half of it, half of your troops aren't going to get there, and so they don't get the pension.
Right.
Half of your legions aren't going to
Yeah.
get. Half of your auxiliaries aren't going to get there, so they won't become Roman citizens. So you're not flooding
Okay.
the empire with Roman citizens. So I think it's that there's there's a calculation. It becomes something that it's achievable. So you can all these people who join up look forward and think, yeah, I'm going to make it, and it's not an unreasonable hope that they will make it. But for about half of them, they won't make it.
Mm.
And,
Okay.
that's
So an aspiration for them to get
it's an
through.
aspiration. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, they were my questions. Does anyone else have a question? You will have to unmute yourself. Okay, all right, lovely. Okay, if we're all done, thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for everyone attending, and hopefully I'll see you at another event soon. All right, thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.